Um, I am Heather Nettles from Art Now Media, and tonight I am pleased and proud to be hosting a talk with gallery artist Kathleen Shaver on her current exhibition, Winter Thaw. So here's tonight's agenda, and we will proceed as follows. I will introduce Kathy, and she will provide a brief overview of the work included in her show. She and I will have a conversation about it, and then we will leave time for your questions through the chat function on Zoom. So just a brief background, little more information. Kathleen Shaver does luscious oil paintings. I think we'll all agree to that. Most of the work featured in the exhibit is created with oil paint on Evelyn paper. These paintings on Evelyn paper present as unique events unfolding within the margins of the paper. In this painting, an armature of gestural brushstrokes is punctuated by liquid drips and bolstered by thick dabs and energetic swipes of paint. This is a group of the artist's most beautiful and colorful work designed to kick those cold, dark winter days and nights, which is why I wanted to do this show during a winter month, because I felt like it was very connected to the natural world. And also it was very, it really, because of her use of color and form, just very brightening, almost like the little crocuses kind of coming up right at the beginning of spring. So I'm just going to quote briefly from her bio. Kathleen Shaver is an abstract painter who studied at Moore College of Art and Design and the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, PAFA, in Philadelphia. Her work has been included in a major survey of contemporary Philadelphia artists at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and in exhibits at PAFA, Woodmere Art Museum, the James A. Michener Art Museum, the State Museum of Pennsylvania, the Attleboro Arts Museum, and more, as in Moore College of Art. She's the recipient of numerous awards for painting, and her work is included in both private and corporate collections. She currently lives and works in the Hudson Valley area of New York, and we understand that that is actually a huge influence on her work. So it's an important attribute. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kathleen Shaver, the artist of the moment.
Thank you. It's great to see friendly faces. Thank you for being here. I'm going to begin by just showing you some images of where I live and work. In 2018, my husband and I moved from Philadelphia to the Hudson Valley. We live in Stone Ridge. It's a small hamlet. It's on the western side of the Hudson River. It's about 25 minutes south of Woodstock. We live on 27 acres of cultivated fields. There's wooded areas, and we also have a lovely meadow. All these views are taken outside of my studio. And so you can see that depending on the time of year, the time of day, the seasons, or even what's currently planted in the fields, it changes quite a bit. We have several old trees on our property, and I think they have a great influence in my work, particularly my more recent work. So this is the environment that I'm immersed in. And I think it's important to say that my interest is not in recreating the vista before me for you. My focus is really on my body in the landscape or in the world and the sensory impressions that I'm receiving. So sight and sound and hearing and proprioception. I'm interested in all of those perceptions and then how my brain processes them. I think that our minds tend to want to conceptualize and categorize and number and name everything. And I think that tendency of our brain can really mute the richness of our sensory experiences. So I'm interested in finding that more primal experience. So for instance, how would you experience a tree if you had never encountered one before? That is where my work is really centered. This is the stone cottage that my husband and I live in. It was built in the 1750s. This is my studio. And if you'll notice the board with a paper on it leaning against the palette table, that's how I work with the paintings on Evelyn paper. I mount it onto boards. I probably have like 10 or 15 at any given time, leaning against the walls around the studio. And I work on them all simultaneously with also the larger canvases. I never throw out my brushes. I love the old misshapen ones that make their unique marks. So never throw them out. I'm going to start showing you some images now. And I think the first thing to say is I don't generally title my pieces on Evelyn paper. I number them. I do, however, title the larger works. And for the most part, the work is vertically oriented. And I think this has to do with my body's orientation, but also maybe sometimes with my mind, right? So I think this painting might be a good example of a sort of more of a headspace. And as you can sense, this painting is a buildup of brush strokes and daubs of paint that create sort of a network of paint. There's a center area of white. This piece was done about, let's see, 2021, so about the same time as the previous piece. And again, it's a buildup of these sort of atomistic brush strokes. Someone once commented to me that this piece in particular made them think of the mind's activity. And I really loved that because to me, it is sort of like one neuron connecting with another or one thought sparking another. This is a detail of that painting. And I think this is a good time to point out that the border is, I think, very important in all my work. The field of paint never goes over the edge of the paper. It's often very self-conscious about where that edge is. And I think this is both an acknowledgement of the nothingness of the paper, and it's also an assertion of the paint. You're aware that there was like a beginning and an ending to all of this paint activity. You don't really have any doubt that this is paint on paper. And yet I think I'm still playing with that very lush seductiveness of paint, which is its ability to magically evoke illusion, the illusion of texture and form and depth. So I think I'm sort of playing back and forth with those qualities of the paint. Now we're jumping backwards to 2020, and you can see in this piece, rather than those atomistic brush strokes, I'm working more with patches or field of paint that I'm moving around. Yet there is this center form, the dark red area. And the texture in this piece really comes from the thickness of the paint buildup. This piece also from 2020. And again, I'm working with more of an amorphous field of paint rather than the atomistic brush strokes. And what I would say about this one in particular, in reference to the edges, it's very insistent here. It's almost like a rim. And for me, it's like when you go to the theater and the curtains open and you see the stage before you, and you know that the stage sets and the actors and the costumes, it's all a fiction. And yet you're drawn into that drama. And so for me, the edge of the paint here is sort of like those stage curtains. You know, this is paint on paper, and yet you're drawn into what the paint might conjure for you. Now we're jumping ahead to 2021. So I'm sort of have progressed from the atomistic brushstrokes back to this working with an amorphous field. And the paint here is very thick. And I kind of enjoy the contrast between the relatively dark areas, the very sort of aggressive paint, and the sort of little polka dots around the edges, which are from paint drips. No one has ever commented about this to me, but I see it in my work, and that is the influence of early Walt Disney. So I grew up, I loved Fantasia and Snow White and all those films. And I think in my work, there's always a little bit of like cartoonishness or animation. And maybe nobody else sees it, but I sense that early childhood influence.
Excuse me, Kathy, but the last painting, when you talked about Walt Disney, it's almost like in the center from Fantasia, the broom that goes crazy. It's almost like right there in the middle of the painting.
Okay. So, I mean, I know it's there. I love those movies. So here, this painting now is 2022. And I think you see that this focus on a central form is greater. And I think, again, this has to do with my body. It's vertical. I'm rooted to the earth by gravity, as well as, of course, my dependence on the earth. But it also has an upward thrust and an outward reach. And in preparing this talk, there's something about this painting I hadn't really thought about before. There's something about monuments here, about how humans make marks on the world, how we build things up and leave remains. It's a new thought, so I need to think more about that, but I sense that in this piece. This is from this year, so very recent. I'm still focused on a central form. Here it reaches out and then also upwards, kind of like a fountain. I'm working with both fields of paint that I'm moving around, but also the more sort of aggressive gestural stroke. But there's more reference now to nature, to leaves and flowers. There's still a consciousness about the edge, but it's not so insistent. I think it's a little more modulated than some of the previous work. This is the detail of that painting. And I think you can see, I do not plan anything, right? It all happens in the process. There's no planning here. This is also a recent work, and I think you can sense the references to nature. I'm feeling more comfortable with that. There's a central form. Maybe you feel that as tree-like, or you may also see a cross there, which is a very powerful symbol. I think my more recent work, although I'm still working with like big, thick paint, you can see in this detail. I think I'm also working with more liquid, soupy mixtures of paint as well. This is the last piece I'm going to show you, and it's also the first oil on canvas that I've shown with Art Now Media. This painting is 56 inches high and 48 inches wide. It's on canvas, and it is titled Just Human. I think you can see some of the interests that I explore in the smaller works on Avalon paper here on canvas. There's seems to be a central form. Maybe it's like legs with feet or some kind of trunk. and there's all these like sort of like arms or whatever reaching out. In this detail, you can see that sometimes I'm using sort of more calligraphic markings. There's like these little flowers sketched up there, but they're like, you know, the kind of flowers that children draw, right? They're like your diagram of flowers, right? They're, but you can see that the paint is very thick. Here again, I'm working with field areas of paint that I'm blending and moving around, but there's also just daubs of paint applied. Also there's these calligraphic lines. So I paint, I'm going to go back to the on top. And what I would say in ending about this painting is that this is sort of like sensory overload, right? There's like all this busy information going on. And then you sense those lines or areas where it's trying to loop around. And I think of that as sort of like the mind's receiving all this incoming information and wanting to find form in it, to make meaning out of it. And the last thing I'll say is I'm still very conscious about the edge of that canvas as I am with the work on Avalon paper. And I think it's sort of an acknowledgement that my world, our world, so to speak, ends at our fingertips, right? That we understand the world through all of our sensory perceptions. And it's how that information comes into our bodies and into our mind, that and how we formulate it. That's how we understand. Well, may have right off the top that I should answer, and that is, what is Avalon paper?
Yeah.
And let me say that I found out about it just by happenstance, right? So I saw an exhibit of Jack Whitten, who other painters will know. He's an amazing abstract painter who's passed away. Anyways, in this exhibit, he had these works that were graphite and Renaissance wax on Avalon paper. And I was taken with them. And I said, well, I have to get myself some of that. The graphite and Renaissance wax part didn't work out for me. But when I got the Avalon paper and read the product information, it said you can work with oil paint on this. You don't need to prime it. You don't need to worry about linseed oil or solvent on it. And so I thought, okay. And I attached it to my boards. I already had the habit of doing sort of gestural painting on prepared paper. So I thought, great, I don't have to prepare it. And the beautiful thing about this paper is it absorbs liquid. So it will absorb paint and you'll get these lovely soft, like Frankenthaler stains, but it also holds a really thick buildup of paint, and it doesn't crack, it doesn't tear. So that's how I started working on it. And it's really more like a fabric. It's a non-woven synthetic blend of polyester and nylon. I think it was first developed for printmaking, actually.
And it's sort of fascinating that it really, it holds the paint and you can really feel the thickness of it, as opposed, and sometimes I feel like it's less permeable than canvas, but you can correct me if I'm wrong. So it allows this really thick buildup, which is harder to support on paper usually, which is what I like about that.
Right. And it's a very, very different surface than canvas. And actually, revealed here for the first time, I've just taken delivery of an 80-inch wide roll of it. So I'm going to try stretching it.
You already mentioned, one of my prepared questions was inspiration for the Avalon paintings, which you've revealed. And I guess for you, as opposed to other artists, I think it frees you up to really, in a smaller format, and maybe you can agree or disagree, that it frees you up to just really go in there with a lot of paint in a smaller, different material than your works on canvas, which I think have a slightly different quality. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, definitely. So the whole practice of working on the Avalon paper and before that on prepared pieces of paper came from when I was a student. And one of my teachers said, I want you to just work on scraps of canvas or paper. You get 1 hour, that's it. Then stop. And so it's a practice, like an exercise that I've just kept up. And it is almost like a psychological game, right? That a big stretch canvas, it seems like, such a commitment. You got to do something epic, whereas a piece of Avalon paper, it is expensive, but it's not the end of the world. You play a game in your mind, like, if it doesn't work out, it's not so bad.
And I think that's what I like about them, because they're very free. They feel very free, that you can just do, you just do, which I really like. And I think a lot of artists, their process becomes so conscious and so careful. And one of the things I love about these works is it's just, as it comes out, and it's just this incredible miasma of all these different pieces of expression. And
I would say when I first started working on the Avalon paper, there was a real divergence between that initial getting used to it and what I was doing on canvas. And over time, I think I take things I learned from those, from the Avalon paper pieces to the canvas and back and forth. So yeah, it's very experimental. It's very freeing. And every once in a while you get this like amazing surprise of a painting that you think, you believe in. So
I guess, you showed Just Human, which we put up as part of Winter Thaw, because I thought, because of the gestural natures in the painting, just like on the Avalon, I felt like it had a real similarity. And I feel like it really works well with the group, even though it's a giant painting expressed in a slightly different way. There's still that, as you said, things have kind of gone together. Can you say how you think it's different in terms of how you approach and apply the paint?
Well, I think the biggest difference is the quality of the paint because of the two different surfaces. So when I'm painting on canvas, as that paint builds up, it becomes almost like a stucco wall, right? The texture. And maybe a few pieces on the Avalon paper I've done have gotten that kind of texture. So it's different in that way. But also I think because of the size, the Avalon paper is 30 inches by 22 inches. It has more of an intimacy, whereas, a bigger canvas, it's generally your body size, but that's a different experience.
Yeah.
And my larger pieces take me just a lot longer. Mm-hmm. They just take me a lot longer.
So I'd like to change gears a bit. And I want to ask you a question because of your really expressive use of color. I want to ask what your favorite color or colors are. If you have, maybe it's every week, but do you have favorite colors? Because I see certain things in your work that appear again and again.
My favorite color is the one that I've just discovered that's really working in the painting. That is my favorite color. So, color really is about the relationships. So you can mix up something that looks like a very boring gray, right? But then when you apply it to the canvas, depending on how well the painting's going, it might just sing because of its relationship with other colors. So, and that feeling of when you discover a color, right? Like there are painters, Alex Katz is probably a good example, who spend a lot of time strategizing what their colors are going to be. And that's it. There's like a recipe. I don't work that way at all. I have to kind of find it, and you might go through a lot of mud before you get there. But to me, that's the excitement of color, is when you're like, wow, look at that. But having said that, working with Paraline Red and Prussian Blue are gorgeous colors to work with. So.
Can we look at slide 15, which is 88C? Okay, so speaking of color, and so the tan in the center of that painting, and the blue at the top, and the blue in the lower right-hand corner, I feel really make this painting. It is not, that color is not my favorite color, but in this painting, I feel like, you know, the fact that you were able to pop that on and harness it in such a way that it actually looks beautiful, I think really makes this painting outstanding. I don't know what else to say about it, but when you first look at it, you said, this is a very dark painting, but then you see all of these relationships, as you mentioned, and the fact that there's sort of like little pops of these primary colors, the blue at the top, the blue at the lower, and then this tan is just, it's really interesting that you have sort of this almost, you're able to almost use like transparent color and then color with added white, and make them work very well together. And I think that's an interesting skill for an artist to be able to do, especially an abstract artist, because a lot of times you'll see the idea of whether you're adding white or not white when you're creating an abstraction. So,
well, and sometimes you find the color when you're working on another painting, right?
Okay.
You know, you'll be working on painting and you'll mix up the color and you'd be like, oh, I feel this over here. So I find that sometimes, you know, working on several pieces at one time will, the paintings will interact, and I'll discover a color that way.
So I think that actually takes me to another question I want to ask about your painting process, and the fact that you're working on multiple kinds of paintings, as well as different images, as well as a few sculptures thrown into the mix. I think it's sort of fascinating that there is this sort of movement between an influence. And I would say the most current images in Winter Thaw, the two paintings from 2023, 226C, and the other piece that we've added. I have two in there, and they just really show this really interesting. I wonder if you worked at them at the same time, or were they one after the other?
I was working on them simultaneously. I think this one, I can tell by the numbering, this one was finished later.
Right.
The numbers give me the chronology. Yeah, but I was definitely working on them around the same time.
So I think another question that I want to ask, and I thought would be interesting in this forum to talk about, was how all these, in these very abstract paintings, the realistic references that sneak into the work, just like the Disney reference, I feel like trees, nature, weather, the idea of weather, the personification of weather comes into mind. You know, it's interesting how you're able to balance between the idea of I just feel like trees are so, the idea of trees, and you're seeing trees just are always in your work. I don't know how you feel about that, but how do you balance those things with the abstract elements? Are you do they just kind of appear? Are you thinking about them in your mind at all? How do these things just come to pass?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think there is this obvious symmetry between our bodies and trees, right?
Yep.
We have arms and that.
Yep.
And trees are such a potent symbol. They figure in fairy tales and mythology, and of course they're all around me. But again, I think it's also my orientation towards the canvas or the paper is always one of my body, right? And so there's always this interplay between whether it's a human form, although I don't think I'm trying to paint a human form, but I want to reach out, I want to reach up. And so I think it's just like a very primal orientation.
Okay. All right. Again, you live in a very beautiful natural setting, with the land around you and this beautiful stone house. I think we've already discussed a bit how it contributes to your painting. Do you think it will, looking forward, do you think it will continue in that vein, or do you feel like that's been being absorbed, or you think it will always be part of your process? This influence, like I feel like you're really at a certain point where it is just kind of going forward and you mentioned the orientation of the body. I just always think of nature when I see your paintings. So I find it, but bodies, our human bodies are part of nature, but I think of outside human nature, in terms of the paintings. So I think it's very fascinating that these works, you're really thinking of your sort of up, vertical, horizontal. I'm thinking about where you live and the trees that you're seeing and their influence. Do you think
it would seem that it's been my dream to live in the Hudson Valley, so I'm not planning on moving away. But where my work might go in the future, I think would probably have more to do with how much I think about our way of thinking and how we experience the world. So my very, very early work was figurative, yet it was conceptual. So I was thinking about how the mind works even then. So I think that's really the core of my work. And I don't know where like that could take me, right?
Yeah.
But I am very immersed in, I walk out of my little stone cottage and I'm in the middle of this gorgeous field. And of course, we're very influenced by our environment.
Well, I noticed Stephen Zema says to everybody, variations of green appear in the new and older work, a not so easy color unless you're referencing the landscape. And I would completely agree, unless you're talking landscape paintings, abstract paintings with green are very hard to do, to understand. And I think that's like the fact that you're then getting the brown and the red and the blue in there and the white and the tan. It's just a real symphony of these variations of color. So,
well, and I actually have a little story about green.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah. And it goes back many years to when I was young and I was in nursing school. And I saw this article on a bulletin board, and it was about a man who had been born blind, and he had reached adulthood and he had never had vision. and a surgery was developed. I guess it was probably a retinal transplant. I don't know. But as an adult, he saw the world for the first time.
Oh.
And he was quoted as saying, I can't get over green. Green is so intense, it's almost unbearable.
Oh.
And I thought to myself, oh, I'm missing out. Like, I see grass, I see leaves. I've never felt that green was unbearable. And after I read that, I just have had this mission, like, I need to see the world as if I had never seen it before.
Mm.
I have to stop like filtering it. And so I will often, when I'm, looking at the landscape, think about this man's experience of green, and it inspires me.
That's a really poignant and beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that. I guess that kind of goes into a more general question. If you had like one or two things that you would like people to know about your painting that we haven't discussed yet, maybe you could comment on that.
What I would say, and maybe it's a comment about painting in general, right? Like, we're looking at these images on a digital screen, right? And boy, is that technology been great for artists. Like, we can share our work with so many people. And especially like during the pandemic, how fabulous to be able to connect on Instagram and whatnot. But paint is a physical substance, and a painting is different on a digital screen than it is when you're standing actually in front of it. To see a painting is a physical encounter. It's a physical experience. And so I would say to someone, well, if you saw something of mine you liked on the internet, you really have to go see it in person. And I think that's true of any painting, really. A Van Gogh in a book or on the computer screen isn't the same thing as standing before an actual Van Gogh. It's astounding.
I think that's where video has really helped take things to the next level. Like, we have videos on Art Now Media of your paintings, and I think that really does add to the experience. So thank you for that. I'd like to thank everybody for participating and coming. It was great to meet everybody over Zoom. I will, as I mentioned, post the this chat when we've had some more, when I've gotten it, when it's sent to me. And so if anybody has any questions or comments, please visit this beautiful show on artnowmedia.com, and perhaps it'll inspire you to take something home. But again, thank you, Kathy, for your time, and thank you to everybody for coming, and just a round of applause for everybody for participating and for the lovely information. So thank you so much, and I hope you all have a good evening. Bye.